Instagram, and YouTube. So then let's listen in as business experts reveal the how, the when, and the why of business, and they will share their secrets to success and profitability. Today's host is Dr. Shawn Counsel Esquire, coming to you live on the True Honest Talk Show. So, please do me a favor and tell everybody about this podcast. Now it's showtime. So, come on, let's go. All right, it is showtime, and I'm here with my wonderful guest, Dr. Walton Brown-Foster. And today we're actually going to talk about the Black political economy. And we're going to look at some of the objectives for the Black economy during the Civil Rights Movement, as well as discuss what's currently happening in terms of Black America and the wealth gap. So we are going to move the show right along today. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and I welcome graciously Dr. Walton Brown-Foster. Hi, Dr. Foster. Good morning. Thank you for agreeing to appear on the True Honest Talk Show. And why don't you tell our wonderful audience a little bit about yourself?
So thank you so much, Dr. Counsel Esquire, although I know you best as my colleague at Central Connecticut State University in the capacity of your educational role and background as as an instructor and lecturer. And so I am very appreciative of your invitation to talk about this subject matter. A big disclaimer, I am not a financial whiz or business expert. I have my background and teaching and research in political science. I am a University of Michigan PhD in political science. I teach international relations, comparative politics, but I also focus on political economy and race, ethnicity, and in U.S. Government and politics, as well as race and ethnicity in the global context. And in that capacity, I will attempt to respond to your questions and hopefully engage in a very informative interaction and talk with you today about the civil rights movement and economics.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Brown Foster, and it was wonderful to serve on numerous panels and present with you throughout Connecticut, and where I was an associate professor as well as an adjunct professor for almost 2 decades. So let's dive into the questions. So, Dr. Foster, did the Civil Rights Movement address economic justice for Black Americans? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I am a political scientist, and so, and as an academic, of course, the way questions are formed, and I'm sure your legal background informs my approach, or will help you to understand how I approach your question. I think the question is really loaded because of the length of time that the civil rights movement occurred in the past and the present.
Okay.
And so if you're talking about phases, and usually when people talk about the civil rights movement, they're talking about the mid 20th century movement. But from my perspective, the civil rights movement as it pertains to African Americans began in 1619. The struggle began right then and there.
Okay.
And so if we want to focus primarily on the mid 20th century, we have to understand the phase and the impetus and the focus at the origin and the beginnings. And you, Rosa Parks, for example, uh, leaves a testimony that's quite powerful.
Mm.
And that testimony was that when she took the action that she did, and by the way, she was not the first woman,
No, she
of
wasn't.
course, to sit down on a bus, but her role was more or less planned. But one of the
It was
major
strategic.
motivating factors was Emmett Till.
Mm-hmm.
And so when so as we see the momentum and the leadership of Dr. King, and we also have to remember that Dr. King took the uh, took charge of the church in Alabama after Reverend Vernon Johns, and Vernon Johns had a very um, political economic practices, and in which his defiance of the authorities was not only political but also economic. But as Dr. King, as Rosa Parks began to ignite the escalation of the protests, the focus was on the immediate reality of the low intensity, the continued low intensity, unceasing terror and violence against African Americans. Lynchings had continued. The
It was in the
convict
1950s and
system
60s.
had continued.
The what
Jim
system?
Crow,
I'm sorry?
the convict leasing system was
Yes.
still in place
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
in the 50s. I remember even in the 60s as a little girl seeing convicts on the side of the road. So our oppression
Yeah, me too.
in the Americas, in the United States, has been multi-tiered. The systemic apparatus has been both a violent one. You have had structural violence in terms of safety, human safety, our life, our lives, economic structured violence, and political exclusion. And
Okay.
so the civil rights movement had to focus, and it had to define phases. And when you listen to Dr. King's, when you read his writings, when you listen to the analyses that he and others made, there was always this um, consciousness of the role that our community played in the political economy of the country. But as the movement began to focus, there were several different ideological approaches to the process of, number one, obtaining full citizenship in this country and full citizenship rights. And at the time, full citizenship rights, the immediate concern was to address the violence and the bloodshed and the low intensity terrorism that African
Mm.
American communities, especially in the South, but also in the North, were facing. And in the North, it was a much different animal in terms of formal police violence. So I would not say that the so it so it the civil rights movement, the mid-century civil rights movement, did not betray any economic goals. It was a
Okay.
matter of planning and strategy, because there was always this understanding of the structural interaction between the political exclusion uh, our communities faced, the physical and legal violence, the and the economic violence. So it was just a matter of which layer of the onion uh,
You
would
were
be the
peeling.
focus at the point. So
So
Dr.
let's ask. So
King,
let me
we all
ask you, if I may, Doctor Brown Foster. So why don't you define for me and the audience what you mean exactly about economic violence? Why don't you maybe do that
well,
in a quick.
economic violence, wage theft. So our enslaved ancestors came as a product of, as a component of capital. We were capital, property. You know, when you factor in um, uh, the components necessary to produce profit, we're talking about capital
Chattel.
input. And uh, what is allegedly the brilliance of the Southern economy is really ridiculous because it's not brilliant at all. Anyone can make a huge profit if you don't pay your labor. And
Mm-hmm.
you can, in fact, sell your labor to raise funds.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I
Yeah.
said, I'm not a
You're talking
business.
about what Karl Marx talked about in terms of usurpation of the wages of the worker, and
Well, well, Marx. We can talk about the Marxian analysis at some other point, but
well, I'm just saying it's akin to that kind of analysis, the usurpation of the wages of the workers by by their employers during this civil rights movement. So we're just trying to really focus on what I'm sorry. We're just
well,
really
no, I think I'm saying something a little bit different. I
trying.
think what I'm saying is that um, from the start, there is this understanding that the economic injustice
Hmm.
faced by African American communities starts with the very nature of enslavement, in
Right,
which your workers are not workers. You can't
right,
even use the term workers because they are property.
right.
So there is that economic fact. And then even after, and Dr. King has this, there's this wonderful lecture that he gave in which he showed the paradox between and the hypocrisy between the post Civil War expectation that formerly enslaved people who come off of plantations without two pennies to rub must
Hmm.
pull themselves up by the
Right,
straps, while at the same time you
right.
have white Western expansion and the creation of land grant universities, the
Yeah.
creation of homesteading. And I have roots in Oklahoma, and I have family who was there during the homesteading uh, uh, period, in which European immigrants were given a leg up. We know this is even true um, of the New Deal programs, in which
Right.
a huge number of African Americans were left out of it because of
Yes.
the way that the benefits were structured and so on. So there was
And who got the
always
contracts? Who got the contract?
that recognition of the economic, the structured economic violence and inequity, I
Okay.
think. But
And so what was Malcolm X's position on Black economics, if you could just tell our
well,
audience a little bit about that?
I'll get to Malcolm X. So, so I want to make it clear that Dr. King was a very, very um, uh, incisive political, economic, prophetic critic of the American political, economic, social, and moral system.
Right.
And this is often very overlooked. And I think that he was really ahead of the game because nowadays you're hearing the term moral economy. He was talking about a moral economy during his day.
Mm-hmm.
The circumstances are significantly different. He was talking about, and if we recall, upon his assassination, he started off with the Montgomery boycott, which
Hmm.
was economic. That was the
Very much
practice
so.
of political economy. And then he ended with
I am a man
the
campaign in Chicago.
organization of sanitation
Right.
workers,
In Chicago, I am a
challenging
man.
the structure of wages, so on and so forth. So he was
Right.
acutely aware of this.
Right.
But and so I think that is sorely missed in
Well, some
the.
would argue it wasn't missed at all and was actually an igniter for his ultimate assassination, because he was delving more into the realm of anti-Vietnam war efforts, as well as economic justice
And he
for
understood the
Black people.
hypocrisy of
And he started
policies were
articulating it
embraced.
very loudly, and they said that contributed possibly more so to the desires to kill him.
Well, there are there are several, there are a lot of
Theories,
conspiracy
right,
theories, and
as to what
but
caused his death.
certainly all of those factors are should be credibly
Yeah, investigated.
considered.
Yeah.
But my point is that where he was going upon
Hmm.
his assassination was in the direction of a new front of the civil rights movement, which was economic justice.
Yes.
So
Whitney Young.
he like Du Bois. So you have even this theme going back to Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, where you have the Washingtonian focus um, on skill development, economic development, so on and so forth, and the Du Bois focus on mainstreaming into the political system.
Hmm.
Why? Because, and they both were necessary and they both were right. But I think that King, like Du Bois, understood that in the modern Western political economy, politics determines and influences economics,
Hmm.
policies determine labor conditions or have a great role. The relationship between the public sector and the private sector impact the overall position of groups and individuals in the political economy and
Hmm.
in general. So the first phase, mainstream into and have some leverage politically over the apparatus that can facilitate economic development and economic access. If you want to protect the economic rights and create economic access for marginalized people, the leverage you have politically has a huge role. uh, but then there is the private sector. And so you see a lot of different themes and leaders emerging. So Whitney Young
Hmm.
comes in, and the point of the Urban League's origin was
Yeah.
to create and assist to African Americans coming to urban areas from the South, and who had to now compete with all of these new European immigrants. And what were they competing over? Jobs, housing, so on and so forth. So that institution, and when emerged, and when Whitney Young uh, joined the March on Washington, he more or less formed an alliance with Dr. King and the direction of that leadership in terms of creating a twin force of within the movement in which the public sector and the private sector become important actors and influencers. And then the acolytes of Dr. King, like Jesse Jackson, you see the evolution of that phase and the civil rights movement through his Operation Push. And he is the first to uh, Jackson, Reverend Jackson, becomes the first to create a long-term push on Wall Street. So the focus, whereas the traditional focus had been on Washington, D.C., later you see Reverend Jackson, an acolyte
Yes,
of Dr. King, doing what? His Wall Street project. And we've seen great momentum and movement.
absolutely.
Probably not
Absolutely.
enough for many.
But
Then you
it's
also
happening.
have the Elijah Muhammad approach that is kind of a continuation of Booker T. Washington's notion that an independent economy was the most effective route to true liberation for former enslaved people in the United States, African Americans.
And
And
skilled
so,
and skilled and a skilled Black working economy was important to him as well, having certain skills.
well, yes, that was
It's still
true, but I
basic.
think it's also true of the others because when we look at the mainstreaming and legislation that of King and Young and the cooperation between the public sector and the private sector, it was one that um, created and opened the doors for a different type of skill training, whereas Washington was focused mostly on vocational. You
Mhm.
have those that were concerned about also ensuring and a higher access to higher education and those white collar skills as
Yes,
well, and
yes,
creating the doctors and the lawyers and so on. And so you have a
like
very
myself.
comprehensive, I think, economic model.
Okay.
Dr. King also understood that at that point in the 60s, the majority of African Americans in the South were not in the urban areas. They were still in the agricultural areas. They were
Yes,
still largely
agricultural
rural.
workers. Mhm.
So
Yes.
I think all of those areas of the labor force were in mind. It just becomes a matter of strategy. You can't uh, reconstruct completely overnight, although things can fall apart overnight. But I love the saying, the French saying, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more things remain the same. And here we are
Yes. Yes.
in many, many ways. I
Well,
so
Dr. Foster,
so I don't think the civil rights movement betrayed the economic goals. I think it was a matter of phases.
okay, and you were going to tell us a little bit about Malcolm X's ideas about equal participation in America's economy by African Americans. You want to tell us a little bit about that? And
Well, I think that Malcolm was probably
we're gonna be wrapping up
okay.
soon thereafter. Go
Yeah, I
ahead.
think that Malcolm was probably during the phase in which he was the acolyte of Elijah Muhammad was um, the was forthrightly um, clear about the limitations of the other movements,
Okay.
and his clarity was in one point, and that was in order to capitalism, that it was capitalism that had to go.
Okay.
Capitalism and white supremacy were our bedfellows, one creating the other, uh, in essence. And this is during the phase in which he was an acolyte of Elijah Muhammad, and so he embraced the Muhammad Elijah's um,
Agenda.
agenda, which was a complete separation
Hmm.
and the
Nationalism,
creation
Black
of
nationalism.
independent and give us 5 states and
Hmm.
we'll leave you alone and so on and so forth. And but Malcolm spoke about the uh, the problem with capitalism. This was not something that Dr. King was not unaware of either, and
Just different
is you need,
approaches.
yeah, when it comes to the market and capitalism and the evils that they saw in an immoral economic system. And so I think there is this attempt to always separate our great leaders as either
Mhm.
or. You're either this one or that one, or they were separate. I think they were all on the same page, actually. It was just a matter of strategy,
Mhm.
timing, and focus.
Mhm. Okay, well, as for our last question, because we're going to be wrapping this up shortly, and again, we thank our audience for listening in today and staying with us. I just want to pivot a little, Dr. Brown, to the current state of Black wealth in America. And so we've looked at the historical context of the civil rights movement and the political economy then, and you did mention about 1619 and forward. But let's talk a little bit about the Forbes argument that by 2050, Black Americans will have zero wealth. And this is something, quite frankly, that's very distressing to me. And so, in reviewing the article, they clearly discuss, which is it's a problem, the lack of transfer of wealth generationally. That's a problem. That's huge. And
Um,
so,
so
I want I wanted to maybe focus a little bit about whether you see there's been some significant progress since the civil rights movement or not, and what can we do going forward to maybe stave off this zero. It's been a radical decline. They said from 1983 to 2013 there was a 75% decrease in the wealth of Blacks and Latinos, and then in 2020, there was an additional 18% decrease with respect to African Americans and a 20% decrease with respect to Latinos. So this is actually huge. And so, did the civil rights movement fail to address the economic viability of Black America and assist in helping Black Americans obtain wealth?
well,
Did they do
I
that,
think
or did they miss the mark? The leaders in the movement.
well, I think that was the point of most of my discussion. They did not miss the mark in terms of understanding the
Mm-hmm.
issue. I think that the that there was, and Dr. King talked about this quite a bit in terms of, how are you going to have social justice, socioeconomic justice when you're spending
Without
all the
legal,
money on the war in Vietnam?
right?
And so it was more of a betrayal, I think, on the other side, even amongst
Okay.
those allies who
Mm,
uh, began to prioritize other policies that
okay.
basically funnel money away from great social reforms. And we see this happening now, even right before our eyes,
With the
in,
PPP
say,
loans, you
the
mean, with
Voting
the
Acts
lack of
reform.
that money going to
No,
African
well,
American businesses?
no, the with
PPP
say the
money policies had a deleterious effect on Black-owned businesses. So that's an example, I think, of what you're saying. But go ahead.
and, and
Structural
well,
policy.
even when it came to programs for to help minority-owned businesses, the redefinition of minority-owned business generally um, benefited white women who become a
Mhm,
part of the protected class. And
mhm,
then you also have, um, a lot of ways of, putting forth the face of a minority,
yes, that
and then,
51%.
but the ownership is basically
Right.
different. So all of those. So I think it was more. So the implementation and the structures of the politics in essence which is self-interested, really
Mm-hmm.
betrayed the goals. As far as the future prospects, we're talking about largely the decline as a result of income, access to jobs, levels of unemployment. You're talking about the decline in the value of homes as a result of home ownership, which is always the vehicle for wealth in the United States. But it's also very, very complicated because, and this is where I know this is a very difficult subject to address, but when you use the term Black, you're talking about a very inclusive category. And so
Mm.
when we start looking at, say,
Who's black? Yeah.
new immigrants of African descent, you actually find that
They're
they've
doing
done
well.
quite well
Very
economically.
well. Caribbean as well.
Very well, very well.
Hmm. Yeah.
And this is a pattern that's even in Britain.
Yes.
And they were able
Most
to take
educated people
advantage.
in the United Kingdom are people descendants of or immigrant descendants of immigrants who were former descendants of the colonies. Oh yeah, the British
And
colonies.
so
In Africa, they're the most educated people and extremely wealthy.
so
Hmm.
you have this new diaspora factor that are
Yes,
doing quite well.
very.
Um, um, and some of the gains that were made in terms of policies have been very beneficial to these new Black populations.
Yes,
But when you look at African Americans, there's been this descendancy or decline. And so the view is, well, immigrants are just more hardy and they're so on and so forth. And it's not that, it's something else in terms of access and access to capital. And quite frankly, um, certain, I think, maniacal choices that are made on the part of creditors, on the part of certain person individuals in power. And then you also have another paradox, even amongst African Americans, and that is this the wealth gap within our community. Some
okay.
of us are doing fabulously well. You
Yes.
have, for the first time, a lot more named millionaires and billionaires than ever before. And so
Right.
you have the billionaire who basically bought off and paid off the uh,
Yes.
the
Student loans.
debt of a
Yes.
whole class of Morehouse
Yes.
grads.
Yes. I
He's a
saw
billionaire.
that.
You have
Yes.
Oprah. You have you have a small percentage. Everything is relative. You have Tyler Perry, who bought a Fort McPherson and has a huge
Tyler Perry
complex.
Studios. Oh yeah.
Can't do that without capital.
And
So
then
within
the
our
grants to
community, we
Spelman
have
and Howard, traditional HBCUs. There were a number of benefactors, and they gave millions and millions and millions of dollars to HBCUs during the pandemic or at the beginning of the pandemic. So just huge that will offer
well,
a number
I
of
know that
scholarships. I'm sorry.
The Jeff Bezos's former wife, McKinsey, gave a lot of
Yes,
money
she
to.
sure did.
So,
And
but
just
so you
and
do have this
mhm.
huge gap. And then there's the media. Every time you turn around on television, you see Black people doing very well,
Yes,
right?
some are
But
doing extremely well.
yeah, and that's the illusion. Uh, Whereas our community is really divided in terms of an income gap,
Mm-hmm.
and
Depends on who you're talking to, is what you're saying.
it is very distressing, and it is distressing because and my uh, the data that I get from the Pew Forum
Yes, that's a good source.
suggests that it's going to be continually worse in the past, and this is where the wisdom of the political focus of the movement is so important, because the gap can be clearly addressed through policy. And there are two good signs uh, that I see. And one happens to be the appointment of two women from Michigan. The first from uh, the faculty of Michigan State University for the first time in the 108 years of the Federal Reserve, an African American woman is appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, which controls, of course, our banking system. And then the second was just yesterday, the former provost of my alma mater, or the provost of my alma mater, who identifies as being Jamaican American, has been appointed the president of the Boston Federal Reserve.
I saw
And what's
that.
important
Yes,
about and what is
I
important
saw
about the
that.
federal
I
what
think
is
the first
important about
African American woman in the the Boston Federal Reserve, right? I think the
well,
first
she
one.
identifies as Jamaican American. That's
Okay.
in her bio.
So
She
first black
identifies.
woman. First black
Yeah,
woman, right?
she's the first
First,
black woman.
right. Okay.
But the
Yeah, I saw that. First one.
but the but the her um, oversight comes from the Board of Governors, where the
Mhm.
MSU professor was appointed, because the Board of Governors oversees all of the 12 Federal Reserve banks. And why this is important is because many of the economic policies that the Federal Reserve implements impact homeownership,
Mhm.
impact availability of credit. The president of the Atlanta Federal Reserve is Bostic, an African American male. And in fact, in one of the issues of the online journal that I edit, I posted his his article in which the Federal Reserve and Federal Reserve presidents are very conscious of diversity, inclusion, and the impact of the banking system on creating some of the inequities in terms of, for example, interest rates and the impact that has on employment and unemployment, availability of credit. These are policies. And without access to the policymakers, I would say the prospects are awful. But because we are seeing more sensitized policymakers as a result of the civil rights movement, that might be that bright light, that candle light in the tunnel. And hopefully, those uh, actors in the economic system and the private sector, and the Federal Reserve is not private, but it's public and private. Perhaps we will see a cultural shift and a different focus and sensitivity as to how these economic policies, beyond what Congress does in terms of social spending, but in terms of the fundamentals of the way in which our um, economy at home actually works, perhaps that will be a saving grace. But if we are left to the wolves with those statistics, I think that it's a very, very dire situation.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for being the special guest here on the True Honest Talk Show. You were incredibly informative. I'm sure my audience feels a lot more aware of some of these issues. I want to thank you again for your time. I know you're extremely busy. So we're going to say it's a wrap, everybody. Thanks for listening in to True Honest Talk Show with Dr. Shawn Counsel Esquire and our wonderful host, Dr. Walton Brown-Foster. So I'll be seeing all of you again soon with my next guest. Thank you and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to True Honest Talk with your host, Dr. Shawn Counsel Esquire. Please subscribe to my podcast so you will know every time I post a new episode. You can reach me on Instagram at True Honest Talk. That's TRUHONEST. Talk. Until next time, please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay